Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Weiss, and I am going to be talking today about James Joyce. I don't often give presentations or lengthy presentations about a particular author. I teach a lot of different authors from a lot of different places in the world. James Joyce is certainly worthwhile, I think, as I'm going to explain why it's worthwhile for us to spend a few minutes and learn a little bit about James Joyce and a little bit about Irish history, and a little bit about the historical context where James Joyce is coming from. Also, speaking about James Joyce, and in an earlier lecture on modernism, I spoke about James Joyce. We talked a little bit about Ulysses. This is going to be geared towards Dubliners, a collection of short stories which was published in 1914. The last story of that collection is called The Dead, and this is a kind of preface to my students that are going to be reading or hopefully have read that story. Also, talking about James Joyce is very close to me because I had the opportunity in the early 90s to live in Ireland, and oftentimes before this particular moment in history, I would make a joke and say, this is BC. I traveled BC, referring to my age? No, referring to before children. Nowadays, BC might be before Corona, which has facilitated why I have put many of my lectures to video. Because I had the opportunity in the early 90s to live in Ireland for about 4 months, and so reading and teaching about Irish literature is very close to me, and at some point we're going to return to normal. I'm not quite certain what that normal is going to look like or what that might mean academically or in terms of studying abroad. So many sort of strands of things that are going to be changed in our society. So James Joyce, born 1882, died in 1941. A little bit about his life. He was an Irish novelist and poet. Wrote during the early 20th century. One of the major writers of modernism. He is best known for his novel Ulysses, which was published in 1922, which I think, and I've said this before, perhaps one of the most prolific decades in literary history, certainly a very prolific decade for the modernist. Ulysses was a novel that did so many different things. Ulysses is the Latin name of Odysseus, and this was not a story about the great hero of society. Rather, this was a story about Leopold Bloom, a regular sort of ordinary guy. James Joyce helped popularize, helped pioneer, helped create this, the idea of stream of consciousness, to write down on the page what we might be thinking in our heads. And he's not the only one who did this. I mean, there were other writers. Virginia Woolf is another one that comes to mind. And there were other writers that worked in this area. William Faulkner was one of them as well. But James Joyce, I think, is well known for this narrative technique. And Ulysses is the story of a day in Leopold Bloom's life. It was a novel that had difficulty getting published. Again, this is not the great Odysseus who travels around the ancient world to get back to his home in Ithaca doing all sorts of great things. This is just Leopold Bloom stopping to have something to eat and talking to somebody and listening to a woman singing. And what made this novel very controversial? There's scenes about masturbation, scenes about defecation, things that people do in their everyday lives. And this is really the first time that these sort of gross things of the human condition were written about in this way. These were not heroic, these were just the everyday. Joyce was born to a middle-class family. Why is that important? It may help us understand some of his writing. He was not born wealthy. He was supposed to become a priest, and Joyce was not really interested in doing so. Early on in school, he showed a knack for language and for writing, and Joyce knew somewhere around 17 languages. For the first 20 years of his life, he lived in Dublin. where all of his stories take place in Dublin or in Ireland. And after 20 or 21 years old, he lived in Europe, in Zurich and in Trieste. And he was very unhappy with Dublin for a variety of reasons, and yet he was working out his unhappiness in some ways, speaking and writing about Dublin and Ireland. Quote here at the bottom, "For myself, I always write about Dublin, because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities of the world. In the particular is contained the universal." And it is said that if you were to map out all of the areas mentioned in Ulysses, you would have a fairly accurate map of Dublin. So James Joyce, celebrated as a great modern writer, celebrated as really one of the greatest writers in literary history, and certainly celebrated in the early 20th century as a very important Irish writer to folks in Ireland. During the early part of the 20th century, there was something called the Gaelic Revival, or the Irish Revival, where people and organizations, writers and scholars and thinkers came together in Ireland, and they were concerned that modernity, this point in time in history, the early 20th century, was moving so fast and moving forward that traditional values were being left behind. And this is one of the sort of complexities that Joyce explores in his short story, The Dead. And we have this sort of interaction between Gabriel and some other of the characters about tradition and hospitality and things like that. Well, in this Irish revival, writers went out, for instance, William Butler Yeats, and he gathered folk tales and folk songs and created poetry out of them, gathering up mythology, interested in preserving Irish culture before it was left behind during this modern moment. Now, in a way, James Joyce is a part of that movement because he was such an important Irish writer, but he was not really a direct part of the Irish revival. He didn't really have time for it. He wasn't living in Dublin. He wasn't living in Ireland. He was living on the continent, in Europe. But he was a part of this great literary tradition. And particularly with William Butler Yeats, who wrote very famously in his very famous poem, Easter 1916. And here I have a portion of it that I will read. "I will write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is warned, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born." Very famous words by William Butler Yeats, "are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born." This was in a collection of poems, Easter 1916, a collection of poems called Michael Robert and the Dancer. And in Joyce's novel, Portrait of a Young Man as an Artist, or excuse me, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, I should say, which was published in 1918, I believe, there's a kind of discussion that he's having with William Butler Yeats, and a kind of dig, if you will. Michael Robert, a reference to W.B. Yeats, remembers forgotten beauty, and when his arms wrap her round, he presses in his arms the loveliness which has long faded from the world. Not this, not at all. I desire to press in my arms the loveliness which has not yet come into the world. Now, what's interesting here is that William Butler Yeats is embracing tradition and, as I said, folklore and folk songs and history and that sort of thing. And James Joyce, his character in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, is saying that we should not be looking backwards. We should be looking forwards. And again, we get this sentiment in his earlier collection from 1914, Dubliners, in the character of Gabriel Conroy. So as I said, he went to a Jesuit boarding school. Religion and Catholicism play a large role in Irish culture. We see this in Ulysses. We see this particularly in Dubliners. We see this a little bit in Portrait, Religion, the sort of oppressive nature of it, the structure of thinking and that sort of thing, some of the things that modernists in general were reacting to. And for Joyce, it had to do with the institution of religion. He married Nora Barnacle, a young woman from the Connemara in County Galway who was working as a chambermaid. Why is this important? First of all, I'll tell you that the Connemara is absolutely beautiful. It is on the western side of Ireland. You go to Galway, which is on the western coast, and then either rent a car or you can hitchhike and go into northwestern Ireland. It is a stark place. It is a beautiful place to go visit. I went to a town in the early 90s called Clifton. Now, when I was a student, I was with a group from Michigan State University, and there was about 10 or 12 of us. And for some reason, I was the only person who had classes 3 times a week. And this was at the Dublin Writers Museum. There was a conference room where we got together and we discussed literature. But everybody else was in school 5 days a week. And so what did I do the rest of the week? I think it had to do with credits. I traveled. And in the early 90s, as I think it is probably still today, well, at least in the early 90s, Dublin was, I think, the safest place in Europe. And I was there during the winter months, but I hitchhiked all over Ireland. And I took a train to Galway, and I took a bus to the Connemara, and I was in this town called Clifton, and at least for me, it felt like it was the middle of nowhere. Now, back in the early 90s, there was no internet, and there was no cell phone, so this really was the middle of nowhere. Because it was the winter and public transportation was not running regularly, once I got to Clifton and I was going to be there for just what I thought was going to be the weekend, what I hoped was going to be the weekend because I had to be back in school, I checked into a bed and breakfast, and I remember the proprietress asked, well, when are you going back? And I think I came in on a Friday, and I said, well, you know, I need to leave on Sunday. And she said to me, well, how are you doing that? There's no bus service. It runs here once a week. And I sort of went into a panic. And I said, well, how am I going to get back to Galway? How am I going to get the train? How am I going to get back to Dublin? You know, I have to get back to my class. And she said, don't worry about it. And she said, let me make a couple of phone calls. And she called up some friends of hers, and she found me a ride back on Sunday. And I hopped in the car with somebody, and we made the hour and a half or so drive back, and it all worked out. Very pleasant memories of traveling in Ireland. The Connemara, as I said, a beautiful place. So why is it important here, getting back to James Joyce, why might it be important that Joyce married Nora Barnacle, this woman from County Galway? This shows up in The Dead with Gabriel marrying Greta. And we're going to talk just for a few minutes a little bit later on about the separation or the disparity between the urban and the rural. And we see this disparity played out in The Dead. A couple of quotes here. Joyce's works are compact, each book a small universe of riches and complexities, with meaning folded upon meaning. So a kind of general statement about Joyce's works. I think Dubliners is probably the most accessible of his works to read and study. Portrait of an Artist, I think, is also fairly accessible. Ulysses, and I remember this from my own experience, the first time encountering Ulysses as a student myself in the early 90s, we would only read 3 or 4 pages at a time. The sentences are oftentimes not full sentences. There are different thoughts juxtaposed together. And after 3 or 4 pages, 5 pages, it's kind of difficult without stopping and breaking things down. The novel that he published after Ulysses is called Finnegan's Wake. And Finnegan's Wake was an experimental novel that he put together. And as I said, Joyce knew over a dozen languages, and this is quite apparent in Finnegan's Wake. This is about a man whose last name was Finnegan, and this is at his funeral. And one of the things that Joyce was doing was essentially creating a new language, a kind of linguistic shorthand from various languages. It's a very difficult read. What's also interesting, I think, about Joyce and in literary studies is that there are few authors that people spend their entire lives on. Yeah, sure, people spend their entire lives on William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, but there are some authors that, sort of big ones, let's say Shakespeare. There are literary scholars that only read and primarily read and study Shakespeare. Joyce would also be one of those authors. So there's not a lot of those kinds of authors, but Joyce is one of those sorts of authors that people will spend their entire lives reading. So again, other works include Dubliners, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. Joyce is difficult. Many scholars spend, as I said, their entire lives reading his few novels. Important contributions to modernism in language, organization of narrative. And he is considered, as I've said before, one of the greatest writers in the 20th century. And just to give you, sort of hint, we may read Dubliners and you may say, oh, I like it, I don't like it. But in literary history, he is considered one of the greatest writers. And here's just a couple of images here. 100 Best Novels. Ulysses shows up as number 1. And another list, Top 10 Works of the 20th Century. Ulysses shows up as number 4, and Dubliners shows up as number 5. So what does this suggest to us? He's an important writer. So other writers of the period, as I said, William Butler Yeats and Samuel Beckett. I think the next slide I have a map, but these images here, I've always taught that landscape and environment play an important role in an author's in the author's literary context, and I think Ireland is no different in that respect. The image that I have over my left shoulder are the Cliffs of Moher. Very picturesque, very postcard-esque. I had the opportunity to return to Ireland in 2016 and in 2018. And in 2018, I went to the Cliffs of Moher. It was the beginning of March. They were impressive, very impressive. What was also impressive were the 60 full-size touring buses that were in the parking lot and all of the people that were there. And these are, this is during the winter months. What was impressive about that is because the roads to get to the Cliffs of Moher are very narrow. And often the residences have stone walls built right up against the, sort of country lanes. How those buses got there and winding through the mountains, I have no idea. The image on the right-hand side is an image from the south of Ireland in County Cork, and this is an image of the seaside town of Kinsale. Very worthwhile to rent a bicycle or go for a walk. What else is Ireland known for? Well, I talked a moment about religion plays an important role in Ireland and in Irish history, as does music. And you're probably familiar with Guinness as a drink, as a popular drink in Ireland, a Guinness, but more importantly, going to a pub. And this map of Ireland here, on the let's see here, west side of Ireland, County Galway, and going north and south, there are these little communities, the Ring of Kerry, the Dingle Peninsula, these little seaside towns north and south of Galway, where they have little pubs, and very famous artists and singers and musicians go to these various places, and you can sort of be what, again, I'd consider for myself in the middle of nowhere, although that's not really true anymore with phones and internet and things like that. But these small pubs and you might not know it, but the person that is singing is world famous, or at least nationally famous. Image in the upper left-hand corner, at least over my left shoulder, is an image from the Connemara, and over the other image over my right-hand shoulder is an image from the Wicklow Mountains, which are south of Dublin. We might also be familiar with Ireland a little bit more recently from the Skellig Islands, and what famous movie was in part filmed in the Skellig Islands? Well, Star Wars. The Skellig Islands, along with a whole series of other islands off the west coast of Ireland, are often very difficult to get to. Which makes sense why communities existed there on these various islands for short periods of time, because living there just became too difficult. It became too difficult to grow things, too difficult to bring resources. When I was in Ireland, both in the early 90s and the couple times in the last few years during the winter, there was no regular service out to the islands, and the Atlantic Ocean was too rough to traverse. All over Ireland, some of the best preserved castles and structures, ruined abbeys, hotels that you can stay at that are in castles and things like that. What's really neat about Ireland is that if you rent a car, within a couple of days, if you wanted to drive, you could see. Not spending a lot of time in either place or in any place, but you could see a lot of places in a very short period of time. It's very interesting to go to places that are well preserved, in terms of you can go in there and have some food. Well, you used to be able to go in there and have some food, sit in a restaurant, or to see places that are in disrepair and covered in ivy and weeds and things like that. And this is all a part of the folklore of Ireland, the mythology of Ireland, and this is the historical and cultural context that Joyce is writing from. Two, I think, images that I have juxtaposed to one another illustrates the disparity between the urban and the rural. Now, Ireland is not exclusive in this dichotomy. I mean, we have this in some ways here in the United States, but I think it's fairly prevalent in Ireland. Dublin is, I think, today, and maybe it was in the early 90s as well, maybe the largest, smallest city that you will encounter. And in the late 90s, there was a mini Silicon Valley that existed outside of Dublin. Now, the economy in Dublin has not been fantastic, and along with several other countries in Europe, such as Portugal and Spain and Greece, Dublin has recovered better than some of those other countries, but has been lagging behind other European countries after the recession of 2009, 2010, and the crash in the economy, the world recession, if you will, in in the late 90s. But what these two images show, I think, are a stark contrast between the urban environment and the rural environment. And in Western Ireland, as I've said, at least to me, places that feel like they are the middle of nowhere. Of course, these are places where people live, and places where also people speak Gaelic. There is a kind of hesitation in many ways, people that are living in a rural community in terms of thinking about people that live in Dublin. So these are two very, very different worlds. And those worlds, like the world in general today, those worlds have collapsed. As I said, you can get around Dublin you can get around Ireland very, very easily. Car or even public transportation. So going from a very rural area to an urban area, it's not a lot of transition. Back in the early 90s when I was there, it took a little bit more time, but today those areas have collapsed. And sort of the tension between the rural environment and the rural culture and urban culture is that, like many places not only in Ireland but in Europe and I would include the United States, that there's not a lot of opportunity in many ways in terms of education and in economics in rural environments, and so there's this slow draining of people from these smaller communities, and it's these smaller communities that, at least I would suggest to us about Ireland, it's these smaller communities that make Ireland most interesting. You know, come to Ireland, come to these small places, but these places are shrinking, and they certainly rely on people to come and visit. So Joyce's Dublin, all throughout Dublin, there are placards and signs and statues and memorials, not only to Joyce, but to events and people that took place in Ulysses. The two images here, the image on the lower right-hand corner is Marcellos Tower. This is a place that Joyce had visited and shows up in Ulysses. And just recently in 2008, I had never been here before, but this is in a community. Is it near Dunleary? It's about 4 DART stops, or 4 metro train stops south of Dublin, and this is called the Sands. And it's called the Sands because it's full of sand. When the tide is out, the sand stretches miles, at least a mile. People walk their dogs and do all sorts of things, but the water is very far in the distance. And then when the tide comes in, this area gets full of ocean water, and this is another area, a space in Dublin that is written about in Joyce's Ulysses. In The Dead, Gabriel and Greta Conroy spend the night at the Gresham Hotel, and here's an image in the lower left-hand corner, just speaking to the sense of modernity but also of tradition. This is Grafton Street, which today you can find musicians on YouTube and on the internet basking, and there's this is an area just south of the city, just south of downtown. Oh, it's really part of downtown near Stevens Green, and this has Tommy Hilfiger and all sorts of restaurants and coffee shops and places to go and buy things. At least it used to until recently. Hopefully the stores will open, much like we hope that will happen all over. Okay, so I'm going to finish up my last thought here, and I have an image here of what is called a Celtic Cross. And this is a little bit different than a crucifix that you might see in another context. When St. Patrick, when the Anglo-Saxons brought Christianity with them in the 5th century, and this was an imposition on a culture that, an imposition on pre-Christian culture. This was a culture that would be called pagan. There were Druids. It had a different mythology. It was not monotheistic. So when the English or Anglo-Saxons brought Christianity with them and imposed it upon the people of Ireland, and they were forced to do so, they were told that you have to adopt Christianity. So the Irish said, okay, we will do so, and this is what our cross is going to look like. So the cross, as you can see, has a sun or a circular figure where the 2 planes of the cross meet. And this represents the sun or their pagan past. And so this is a kind of subterfuge, if you will, a combination of both the Druidic and pagan past with Christianity, and that different kind of religion or mythology was still practiced in a kind of way, even though Christianity was imposed on the Irish. Okay, so this is the cultural context, the historical context to some degree of where Joyce is writing from, and we see this played out, I think many of these themes played out in Joyce's Dubliners, and particularly in The Dead. Thank you.